How does a company of 108 men hold off an army of 2,500 for 3.5 hours in a tropical downpour, with no air support, no reinforcements within range, and ammunition running so low that soldiers are sharing their last magazine? How does the most decorated Australian company of the entire Vietnam War come home from that impossible afternoon to find that their medals have been downgraded by men who never left their desks, their citations filed in the wrong drawer, and their commanding officer's recommendation for the highest gallantry award rejected because, in the words of the colonel who refused to sign it, this was Vietnam, not Lone Pine? And how does the soldier who deserved that honor spend the next 50 years watching his country build monuments to wars it was proud of, and while the men of the long tan rubber plantation were quietly filed away with the wars it was not? Forget everything you think you know about the Vietnam War and what Australia's part in it looked like. Today we are cracking open a story that the Australian defense establishment spent half a century trying to keep smaller than it was. The true account of the 18th of August, 1966, and the second battle that followed it, which was dirtier, longer, and in some respects, never finished. Before we go in, tell me in the comments, if you were one of those 108 men and the ammunition was running out, what would you have done? Because the answers those soldiers gave in real time will give you chills. Stay until the end, because this story does not end when the guns go silent. To understand what happened in that rubber plantation, you first have to understand the particular kind of hell that was Phuoc Thi Province in the middle of 1966. Not the general hell of Vietnam, which was well documented and amply broadcast. The specific, intimate hell of a province where the jungle had been doing exactly what it wanted for decades, where the people who lived there had been making their own political calculations for generations, and where the enemy had not merely been operating, but had been completely dominant for as long as anyone could remember. The American approach to Vietnam by mid-1966 had settled into a doctrine of overwhelming force that was producing overwhelming frustration. More artillery, more airstrikes, more helicopter assaults against an enemy that simply melted into the vegetation and reappeared somewhere else. The United States Army was fighting a war it had trained for against an enemy that had no interest in fighting that war. The result was a campaign consuming enormous resources and generating statistics that looked like progress and felt like stalemate. Australia was doing something different, and it mattered. The 1st Australian Task Force was assigned its own province and tasked with securing it through long-range patrolling, intelligence-driven operations, and the kind of intimate knowledge of terrain and population that the American search-and-destroy approach never prioritized. Rather than chasing the enemy with overwhelming force, the Australians intended to understand the ground beneath their feet well enough that the enemy could not move through it without being found. Phuoc Thi was not an empty province waiting to be understood. Its principal communist forces were the main force regiments of the Viet Cong 5th Division. The 274th Regiment and the 275th Regiment, plus a local provincial mobile battalion designated D445, which had operated in the area with complete freedom for years. Their assignment was to isolate the eastern provinces from Saigon by cutting the main roads and highways, and they had been executing it with devastating effect against every South Vietnamese unit sent to oppose them. The 275th alone had ambushed and shattered a battalion of South Vietnamese Rangers the previous November. These were not amateurs hiding in the jungle. They were a disciplined, experienced, battle-hardened force with intimate knowledge of the terrain, deep roots in the local population, and a clear strategic objective. Into the middle of their operational territory, in April and June of 1966, the first Australian task force arrived and began building a base. The chosen site was a low hill called Nui Dat in the heart of the province. The logic was sound. A base here allowed the Australians to patrol aggressively outward in all directions, denying the enemy freedom of movement without tying the force to the defense of a populated center. The boldness of the choice was real. So were its consequences. Not to create a security perimeter, the Australians resettled the inhabitants of 2 nearby villages within a 4-kilometer radius. The houses were cleared. The people were moved. A free fire zone was declared across the land their families had farmed for generations. The military logic was unimpeachable. The human logic was something else entirely. The resettlement created immediate and lasting resentment among a population that had already been living under Viet Cong political influence for years. Many of the villagers had family members serving with the 275th Regiment and the D445 Battalion. Australia had not merely built a base in enemy territory. It had evicted the enemy's home community and turned their fields into a killing ground. Within 8 weeks, those fields would earn that designation. So commanding the 275th Regiment was a professional soldier known to his men as Ut Thoi. Senior Captain Nguyen Thoi Bung had been fighting colonial and foreign forces in this province since before most of his current opponents had completed high school. He had rebuilt his regiment after a mauling by the South Vietnamese Rangers. By mid-1966, reinforced by a North Vietnamese regular battalion and coordinating with the D445 Local Force Battalion, he had approximately 2,000 soldiers available and a plan for the base on the hill. Ut Thoi had been in Phuoc Tuy longer than the Australians had been in Vietnam. He intended to remind them of that fact. For several weeks before the 18th of August, a small Australian unit called the 547th Signal Troop was doing something classified and critically important. Using direction-finding equipment to track enemy radio transmissions, the unit had identified a radio set belonging to the headquarters of the 275th Regiment and had begun following it. The transmitter was moving, not erratically, not randomly, but with the patient deliberation of a predator that has selected its target and is closing the distance 1 kilometer every day. From a position north of Zuyen Mok, it moved steadily westward. By the 13th of August, signal analysis placed it near the Nui Dat 2 hill feature, a low rise approximately 5,000 meters east of the base, and then it went silent. So a regiment that has stopped transmitting has either withdrawn or gone to ground, and the direction-finding data suggested very strongly that it had not withdrawn. This intelligence was classified at a level that restricted it to operations and intelligence officers, and the task force commander, Brigadier Oliver David Jackson. Patrols sent to investigate found nothing. The jungle had absorbed the regiment as completely as if it had never existed. What Jackson apparently did not do was tell the company commander, whose soldiers would be patrolling toward the last known location of that headquarters, that the headquarters was somewhere in front of them. The intelligence existed. It was known to people in the chain of command. Captain Brian Wickens, the 6th RAR intelligence officer, I understood the threat clearly enough that he quietly persuaded his commanding officer to upgrade the planned patrol from platoon strength to a full company. He could not explain to the company commander exactly why, because the source intelligence was classified above that level. The real reason for this institutional silence was the tendency to protect the integrity of a classification system at the expense of the people that system was designed to protect. It was a failure of basic operational communication, and it would cost 18 Australians their lives before the afternoon was over. Ut Thoi's plan was a classic technique that had worked against American units in other provinces. The mortar attack on Nui Dat was not designed as a serious assault on the base. It was designed as provocation. a strike hard enough to demand a response, calibrated to force a patrol out into prepared ground. The assumption was straightforward. The Australians would send a company to find the firing positions. That company would walk toward a killing ground. It would be destroyed, and the base, weakened and shaken, would then be vulnerable to direct assault. Coordinating this larger plan, the 274th Regiment was simultaneously positioning itself to ambush any American armored relief column that might attempt to reach the Australians. U Thoi was planning not just the battle, but the battle after the battle. The 275th Regiment's scouts had been watching Nui Dat since its first day of construction. They counted the perimeter posts going in and observed the pattern of patrols coming out. They noted the ranges at which the Australian artillery could fire and the directions in which the patrols were most commonly sent. U Thoi was not improvising when he ordered the mortar attack. He had been reading the Australians for 2 months, and what he had read told him exactly where the gaps were. The mortar strike on the 16th of August was the opening move of a plan whose middle moves were already in position. U Thoi had also arranged something that most analyses of the battle overlook entirely. Attached to the 275th Regiment for the coming operation was an 80-person civil labor company comprising mostly women and older civilians. Its task was not to fight. Its task was to evacuate the dead and wounded from the battlefield as the engagement progressed, on removing as much evidence of the true scale of the enemy's losses as possible. This unit would work through the battle and through the night that followed. It explains more than anything else the gap between the 245 bodies the Australians counted the next morning and the 500 or more killed that all other evidence suggested. Delta Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been in Vietnam for approximately 6 weeks when the 275th Regiment began its approach march. Major Harry Smith was 33 years old, born in Hobart, a Malayan emergency veteran, and by every account of the men who served under him, a perfectionist of the uncompromising variety. Demanding, direct, relentlessly competitive, and completely uninterested in senior approval if that approval came at the cost of his company's capability. Of his 105 Australian soldiers, 68 were national servicemen, young men whose birthday numbers had been drawn from a government conscription ballot, who had been in uniform for approximately 12 months, and who had never fired at a human being in their lives. Smith spent every available hour trying to ensure that what he had was enough. The company's theme song for training marches had been Nancy Sinatra's 1966 hit, "These Boots Were Made for Walking." Smith drove his soldiers to a standard of fitness and tactical proficiency that his soldiers understood as the difference between coming home and not. The company sergeant major was Warrant Officer John William Kirby, Jack to everyone, and Big Jack to the soldiers. Kirby was 31, a veteran of Korea and the Malayan emergency, compact and powerful in the way of men who have trained seriously for decades. He could not keep pace with Smith and the younger soldiers on training runs. He always finished. The distinction mattered enormously to the men watching him. Kirby was what the role required. Steady, technically immaculate, dry-humored under pressure, capable of moving through chaos as though it were a minor administrative inconvenience. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp commanded 11 Platoon. He had been a television cameraman before his service number came up in the national ballot, and by the accounts of those who served with him, he was conscientious and trying very hard to meet the demands of a company that expected a great deal. So the night before the 18th of August, Sharp and his platoon sergeant Bob Buick had a serious argument. Serious enough that Sharp placed a formal charge of insubordination against Buick. Smith reviewed the charge and set it aside. The tension between the two men was unresolved when they went to sleep that night. unresolved when they woke the following morning, and unresolved when they walked out of the perimeter wire together toward the rubber trees. The third figure whose story would define the battle was not Australian at all. Captain Maurice Stanley was a 35-year-old New Zealander from Christchurch, a forward artillery observer from the 161st Battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, attached to Delta Company, along with bombardiers Willie Walker and Murray Broomhall. His job was to look at a map, listen to a radio, and tell the guns exactly where to send their shells. Stanley was methodical, professionally stoic, constitutionally steady. In the hours to come, he would need every quality the description implied. On the morning of the 18th of August, 1966, the entertainers Colonel Joy and Little Patty were at Nui Dat to perform a concert for the men of the battalion. 2 Royal Australian Air Force Iroquois helicopters had flown them up from Vung Tau in the morning and were waiting on the pad to fly them back when the show was done. B Company had returned through the wire to attend. Delta Company was assigned to take over the search. Smith recalled later that his men were not real happy about missing the concert as they pushed through tall grass toward the plantation, the sound of rehearsal music drifting behind them from inside the wire. They did not know, as they moved away from the music, that they were walking toward a regiment. Nobody had told them, because the intelligence that would have communicated this fact was classified above the level at which it was useful. They walked toward the rubber trees in a dispersed formation, alert and professional, expecting to find a mortar platoon that had long since withdrawn. At 2:43 in the morning of the 17th of August, Nui Dat came awake. The first round hit without warning. No sound of a tube firing, no whistle of incoming, just the sudden concussive slam of an 82mm mortar shell detonating inside the base perimeter, followed immediately by another, and another, to end the crack of 75mm recoilless rifle rounds coming from a position approximately 2 kilometers to the east. Soldiers grabbed their weapons and went to their defensive positions. The base stood too. They waited for the ground assault that every military doctrine said must follow a preparatory bombardment of this kind. It lasted 22 minutes. 24 Australians were wounded, several vehicles and structures damaged, and the entire base left in a state of controlled alertness that did not abate for the rest of the night. No ground assault came. The enemy had fired their rounds and withdrawn into the darkness before Australian counter-battery fire could locate them with any precision. By dawn, the firing positions were empty. B Company moved out at first light to conduct the search. They found 5 mortar base plate positions dug with professional care, several weapons pits, and trails leading east toward the long tan rubber plantation. The evidence was consistent with a heavy weapons element that had completed its mission and withdrawn. It was not inconsistent with the presence of a much larger force somewhere ahead, but the immediate picture was reassuring enough that B Company harbored overnight with its primary concern being the concert scheduled for the following day. The detail that the mortar positions had been prepared in advance and not hastily dug under fire should have confirmed that whatever force had used them intended to remain in the area. Mortar base plates are heavy. You do not carry them into a position, fire your rounds, and carry them out again unless the position has tactical value beyond a single use. B Company's soldiers reported all of this. The report went up the chain of command. At the level where it would have mattered most, it arrived incomplete, stripped of the context that the classified signals intelligence had provided and that protocol prevented from being passed down. Smith received his orders on the morning of the 18th and was told to relieve B Company, locate the mortar firing positions, and establish the direction of the enemy's withdrawal. The enemy was estimated to be a heavy weapons platoon of perhaps 30 to 40 men, and was in all probability long gone. He led his soldiers through the perimeter wire at approximately 10 in the morning, to the sound of the concert rehearsal on the other side of the base. They relieved B Company at the plantation edge around midday, ate a quick meal of combat rations, and entered the rubber trees at approximately 3 in the afternoon. The long tan rubber plantation had been cultivated for decades before any soldier walked into it with a weapon. The trees were planted in rows with mathematical precision, trunk after trunk in straight lines that extended to the limit of visibility, creating long corridors of relative openness, alternating with the cover of the trunks themselves. Under the canopy, it was dark, even in daylight. The floor was red laterite mud that had been saturated by days of rain. The place had a particular kind of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of very many things staying very still. Delta Company moved in 2-up formation, 10 and 11 platoons forward, and spread wide. 12 platoon in reserve, company headquarters in the center. The soldiers kept their intervals, kept their weapons up, watched the corridors between the tree rows. They had been told there was nothing out there. Between 3 o'clock and 3:40 in the afternoon, 11 platoon made a series of brief, inconclusive contacts with small groups of enemy soldiers who appeared, exchanged a few shots, or simply fled and vanished back into the trees. The Australians examined what the fleeing soldiers had left behind and registered a detail that should have told them everything they needed to know, but in the confusion of the moment, did not fully register. The men were wearing camouflage clothing and carrying AK-47 assault rifles. This mattered. The local Viet Cong guerrillas of the D-445 battalion carried older Chinese-made weapons and wore whatever they could acquire. A K-47s with new camouflage was the equipment signature of the main force, a full regiment. Smith later said the penny did not drop when they saw those first weapons. This was a failure of the system above the ground, which had classified the information that would have made those AK-47s instantly interpretable as the warning they were. Between that first inconclusive exchange and the eruption of fire at 4:08 in the afternoon, there were several more brief contacts. Single shots, a burst of automatic fire, figures vanishing between the tree rows. From below, the difference between a small patrol covering a withdrawal and the forward screen of a much larger force was impossible to determine, and Delta Company was being tracked and measured by the forward elements of a regiment, and the regiment was deploying around it. At 4:08 in the afternoon, 11 platoon came under fire from front and flanks simultaneously. Small arms and what the soldiers initially identified as heavy machine gun fire with explosive rounds, because rubber trees were being blown apart. What they were hearing was rocket-propelled grenade fire, a weapon the main force used routinely, and the local guerrillas did not. 4 Australians were killed in the first minutes. The survivors went to ground and fought back. Gordon Sharp called for artillery support, and as the first corrections were being transmitted to the guns at Nui Dat, the tropical monsoon broke directly over the plantation. The two events were simultaneous, and their combined effect was to transform the plantation into a place where normal tactical assumptions ceased to apply. Visibility dropped to meters. The noise of weapons fire merged with thunder, and the first artillery rounds arriving from Nui Dat, creating a wall of sound in which individual voices were mostly unintelligible. Stanley was on the radio, calling corrections to 161st Battery. The initial rounds were long. He called adjustments. More rounds arrived. He called more. Delta Company had not expected action. It had found a regiment. Gordon Sharp was trying to save his platoon. By 4:12, his 28 soldiers were being engaged from left, front, and right by a force he estimated at company strength. To place artillery where it was needed, and someone had to determine exactly where the falling rounds were in relation to the platoon's position. This meant observing the impacts. This meant standing up. Sergeant Buick told him not to. The weight of experience and simple tactical common sense were both on Buick's side. Sharp understood this. He stood anyway. The Defense Honors and Awards Appeals Tribunal, reviewing this moment half a century later, would describe it as a selfless act, a disregard for his own life in an attempt to save the men of his platoon. Sharp stood, observed the fall of shot, and was transmitting a correction when a round struck him in the neck. He was dead before he reached the ground. Buick took command without pause, because the alternative was to do nothing, and he was not capable of that. "You are trained to do a certain job," he said afterwards. "And sergeants are trained to take over from the platoon commander if anything happens." I knew what I had to do. What he had to do was direct artillery from a position being engaged from 3 sides, with a platoon already reduced by casualties, in the middle of a monsoon, cut off from the rest of the company. He did it. He brought the guns as close as they could safely come, and then he called for them closer still. At 4:35 in the afternoon, 11 platoons' radio antenna was shot away. At the same moment, 10 platoons' radio operator Private Brian Hornung was shot through the shoulder. The round continued through his radio and destroyed it. Delta Company's 2 forward platoons lost communications with each other and with company headquarters at the same instant. Private William R. Kell, a signaler from company headquarters, ran forward under fire to find 10 platoon and deliver a replacement radio. He reached them. Mention in dispatches was the eventual recognition for this act. It was not enough. Second Lieutenant Jeff Kendall pushed 10 platoon forward in an attempt to reach 11 platoon's deteriorating position. He was hit from 3 sides, and his radio was also destroyed. Smith recalled 10 platoon. He sent 12 platoon under Second Lieutenant Dave Sabin to push up on the right flank. 12 platoon was also repulsed. The enemy were not in company strength. They were in regimental strength, and they were beginning the methodical encirclement their doctrine required. The bugle calls began, the ancient brass instruments used by the Viet Cong to coordinate assaults when radio communications were uncertain, the notes carrying clearly through the rain in the seconds between artillery strikes. Smith could hear them. He understood what they meant. He consolidated what he had left into a tight defensive perimeter and did the arithmetic. 108 men had walked into the plantation that afternoon. 11 platoon had fewer than 15 capable of fighting by 5 in the afternoon. Both forward platoons had taken casualties. Company headquarters was itself under fire. The radio log at Nui Dat recorded the messages received from the field as the afternoon deteriorated. At 4:26, being mortared, want all artillery possible. At 4:31, enemy on left flank, could be serious. At 5:01, enemy penetrating both flanks and to north and south. At 5:02, running short of ammo, required drop through trees. That last message was not a tactical update. It was a statement of how much time remained. At the gun pits in Nui Dat, the gunners of 161st Battery Royal New Zealand Artillery were sustaining a rate of fire that artillerymen are trained to maintain at 4 rounds per gun per minute, and were now doing at 6 to 8. The battery's 6 105mm howitzers had been first into action, joined within minutes by the 2 Australian batteries, and then by 6 American 155mm self-propelled howitzers. More than 60 fire missions over the course of the afternoon. Rounds landing within 50 meters of the soldiers who called them in. This was the procedure known as danger close, and it was precisely what it described. At that range, a 105mm shell had a margin of error measured in tens of meters. The kill radius of a high explosive round was 40 meters in all directions. A gun crew that made an error of elevation or azimuth by a fraction of a degree, would kill the men it was trying to protect. The New Zealand and Australian gun crews worked without pause, feeding rounds into howitzers too hot to touch without gloves, verifying every firing solution, unpacking ammunition carried to the gun line by soldiers dragged in from across the base. Artillery contributed approximately 90% of the estimated 500 enemy killed that afternoon. The rifles of the men in the plantation did the rest. Maurice Stanley could not see any of this. He was standing next to Smith in the shrinking perimeter, holding a folded map soaked through with rain, wiping mud off the grid references with his thumb, speaking into a radio handset in the measured professional language of fire control. Left 50, add 100, fire for effect. Right 25, drop 50, fire for effect. He could not see where the shells were landing. He was working from the corrections called to him by the platoon soldiers when those soldiers were alive and had working radios, and from his own reconstruction of the tactical situation based on the direction and intensity of fire audible through the rain. More than 60 missions, 3.5 hours without a pause that was not forced on him by the presence of the American jets. The critical moment in Stanley's battle came when Buick's platoon reached a state of attrition that Buick himself assessed as unsurvivable, and reduced to fewer than 12 soldiers from its original 28, with enemy troops within 20 meters of their position. Buick keyed his radio and told Stanley to bring the fire down directly onto his coordinates. He was asking the guns to kill him and his remaining men in order to kill the enemy attacking them, because he believed the enemy would complete that killing in any case, and he preferred that the last round serve some purpose. Stanley refused. He brought the shells as close as his professional judgment would allow, approximately 50 meters, and continued adjusting. Buick later said he thought Stanley had walked it far closer than that. The gap between what each man remembered speaks to what the other had achieved. Stanley had placed the fire close enough that soldiers lying in the mud experienced the detonations as physical blows against their bodies, and the enemy advancing toward them experienced them as sudden annihilation. That is the mathematics of danger close. It requires a very particular kind of calm to stand in the middle of it with a map and a radio and keep the numbers exactly right. The message logged at 5:02 reached Nui Dot and created an argument. Brigadier Jackson wanted to send helicopters. Group Captain Peter Raw, commanding the Royal Australian Air Force element at the base, held standing orders that prohibited sending aircraft into unsecured areas. Raw was not being unreasonable. He was following orders. Jackson was not following orders. He was looking at the radio log from the plantation and calculating how many minutes the men there could continue to function without ammunition. Jackson's statement to Raw, witnessed by 5 or more people in the room, was not a request. "I'm about to lose a company," he said. "What the hell's a few more choppers and a few more pilots?" Across the base, Flight Lieutenants Frank Riley and Bob Grandin had been sitting in their Iroquois helicopters on the pad, listening to the battle unfold on their aircraft radios, since the moment it became clear that the concert was finished. They walked into the coordination center and indicated that they were ready to fly. They did not wait for the formal order. They volunteered. Riley and Grandin had started their day in the most routine possible way, on flying Little Patty and Colonel Joy from Vung Tau for a morale concert. Now the same aircraft that had carried Australian entertainers northward that morning would carry ammunition to the men who had been denied the show those entertainers gave. Grandin said later that he thought it was a suicide mission. He climbed in anyway. The 2 Iroquois lifted from Nui Dot and flew east into the storm. The rain had reduced visibility to near zero at any useful altitude, forcing the pilots to fly at treetop height, where every enemy soldier with a weapon could fire directly into the cockpit. The artillery halted while the helicopters were in the air. In the plantation, The first silence in 90 minutes settled over the men fighting in it. That silence was not reassuring. The artillery was the wall between the soldiers and the people trying to kill them. Without it, the distance that had been held by continuous fire was now being closed by men with a significant numerical advantage, who were prepared to absorb casualties at a rate a company of 108 could not sustain. In some positions, soldiers were down to one magazine between two men. Cliff Dole and Bruce Lane arrived over the plantation first and found the smoke signal Delta Company had thrown to mark their position. Dole held the aircraft at 10 meters, just above the rubber trees, while Regimental Sergeant Major George Chin and Major Owen O'Brien pushed boxes of ammunition wrapped in blankets out the door. The boxes fell through the branches and struck the red mud of the company's position. A voice came over the radio from below, in the Australian vernacular that requires no translation. "You bloody beaut, that was smack on." The guns resumed the moment the helicopters cleared the area. Jack Kirby was already moving. Throughout the battle, the company sergeant major had been doing what his role required: distributing ammunition, collecting the wounded, maintaining the coherence of a perimeter being pressed from multiple directions by a force with a 20-to-1 advantage. He had been doing this while crossing open ground, swept by machine gun fire and fragmentation, without cover, for hours. When the dropped ammunition landed, it needed to reach soldiers spread across the full extent of the perimeter. Kirby and Sergeant Rankin broke open the boxes in the mud. Machine gun belts were carried to the M60 positions, and rifle magazines were delivered to the forward sections. Kirby came to a wounded gunner named Webb, picked him up, carried him to the company aid post, went back to put the wounded man's machine gun out of action so it could not be captured, and returned to the distribution circuit. He passed Private Brian Riley's position and pointed at a figure moving in the trees. "Do you know who that is?" "No?" "Well, shoot him." The combination of precise tactical instruction and complete composure under fire was exactly what the soldiers around him needed to hear at that moment. Then Kirby saw a machine gun crew setting up. A wheeled Goryunov heavy weapon had been moved to a position approximately 50 meters from the company perimeter, close enough that its field of fire, once established, would sweep the entire Australian position. And completion of its setup would change the mathematics of the battle entirely. Kirby went alone toward the enemy. He silenced the weapon by killing its crew. He came back. He continued distributing ammunition. At 6:20 in the afternoon, the radio log at Nui Dot recorded Delta Company's self-assessment. Enemy could be reorganizing to attack. 2 platoons approximately 75% effective. 1 platoon almost completely destroyed, reorganizing for all-round defense. That last phrase was not a tactical update. It meant the perimeter had contracted to the point where there was no longer a distinction between the front and the flanks. The circle was small. The enemy was forming up for what every indicator suggested would be the assault that finished it. At 6:55, the soldiers of Delta Company heard something through the trees that was not artillery and not rifle fire. It was the sound of M113 armored personnel carriers, 11 of them, carrying A Company of the 6th RAR under Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, moving through the plantation with the particular mechanical thunder of tracked vehicles in wet terrain. The enemy heard it too. The armored vehicles broke through their encircling lines and drove into Delta Company's position. The Viet Cong began to withdraw. All firing ceased as though the tap was turned off. That was Harry Smith's description, and nothing more precise has been written about that moment in the decades since. The monsoon that had been generating its own percussion section for the entire battle also began to ease. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of too many things having stopped at once, the silence of men who have been bracing against a force for hours and have had that force suddenly removed and cannot yet trust its absence. Delta Company emerged from its positions and did what soldiers do. They checked on their mates, counted who was missing, reloaded what they had. 2 men were unaccounted for. Private Jim Richmond and Private Barry Meller, both of 11 Platoon, had been left behind in the withdrawal from the forward position during the worst of the fighting. Wounded, unable to move independently, separated in the dark and the rain. They had lain in the rubber plantation among the dead of 11 Platoon through the entire night, listening to the artillery hitting the ground around them, of hearing the movement of the enemy as the 275th Regiment withdrew past them in the darkness. They did not know if anyone would come back. They did not know if there was anyone left. They waited. The clearance patrol returned to the plantation on the morning of the 19th with infantry and armored carriers, and what they found would stay with every man who walked that ground for the rest of his life. The soldiers of 11 Platoon were lying in their firing positions, still facing the direction from which the enemy had come, their weapons still pointing forward. The overnight rain had washed them clean. They had not moved because they had died in the act of fighting, and the positions they occupied in death were the positions they had held in life. Richmond and Meller were found alive, both wounded. Both had survived the night in the mud, in the dark, among the dead, without any certainty that anyone was coming for them. They were found, treated, and evacuated. The count of enemy dead was eventually halted at 245. The bodies were buried where they fell. 3 enemy soldiers were captured alive. Australian casualties were confirmed at 18 killed and 24 wounded. Of the dead, 11 were national servicemen, young men conscripted under a ballot system, trained for 12 months, sent to Southeast Asia to fight. Their average age was 21 years. Harry Smith was given 18 hours to write the citations for his men. The Second Battle of Long Tan was fought not in a rubber plantation, but in memoranda, committees, classified files, and the bureaucratic territory, where institutional convenience and administrative pride conspire to make truth difficult. It began 18 hours after the guns went quiet, when Smith was told he had, until the following morning, to produce citation recommendations for every soldier whose conduct warranted recognition. 18 hours, for a battle that had lasted the better part of an afternoon, for 108 men, Smith wrote quickly. He recommended Jack Kirby for the Victoria Cross, the nation's highest military honor, awarded for conspicuous acts of bravery in the presence of the enemy. He took the recommendation to Lieutenant Colonel Townsend. Townsend refused to sign it. There were no Victoria Crosses awarded in Korea, Townsend said. This is Vietnam, not Lone Pine. I will only sign a Distinguished Conduct Medal, Smith argued. Townsend held firm. Smith wrote Kirby up for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the second highest award for non-commissioned officers under the imperial system, and submitted the citation, knowing it was not what the man's conduct had earned. He said decades later that he regretted this decision every day after making it. The awards process took the citations Smith had produced in 18 hours and worked on them for considerably longer, with considerably less urgency, and produced considerably less. Smith's own recommendation for a Distinguished Service Order was downgraded to a Military Cross. His platoon commander's recommendations were similarly reduced. Several soldiers received nothing, and some citation paperwork disappeared from the administrative chain between the unit and the awards authority, and was not rediscovered for decades. The explanation offered, when an explanation was offered at all, was the imperial quota system. Each unit received a fixed maximum of gallantry awards, determined not by the deeds performed, but by the administrative capacity of the system to process them. The less charitable interpretation, which Smith made publicly, repeatedly, and informal submissions to multiple government inquiries over the subsequent 5 decades, was that senior officers who spent the afternoon of the 18th of August at Neuilly Dot received decorations for the battle at the expense of the junior officers and soldiers who spent it under fire in the plantation. This claim was stated on the public record, while it was not refuted. The United States Army reached its own assessment without bureaucratic delay. On the 30th of May, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson awarded Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award available to an American military unit for extraordinary heroism. It was one of only 2 such citations ever awarded to Australian units. The Americans thought the fight deserved the highest possible recognition. The Australian Army had given it a quota. Not a single soldier of the 1st Australian Task Force received the Victoria Cross across the entire Vietnam deployment. The task force fought from 1966 to 1971. 520 Australians died in the war. The men of the task force who came home, us and the families of those who did not, drew their own conclusions about what this meant. Smith fought the second battle with the same methodical determination he had brought to the first. Reports, submissions, committee appearances, lobbying, letters, and more letters spread across 5 decades of increasingly stubborn institutional resistance. In 2007, Prime Minister John Howard initiated an independent panel review of the Long Tan honors. In 2008, the panel's recommendations were accepted. Smith's Military Cross was upgraded to the Star of Gallantry, the modern Australian equivalent of the Distinguished Service Order, the award he had been recommended for in 1966 and denied. 2 of his platoon commanders received the Medal for Gallantry, on 40 years after the battle at which they earned it. In April 2015, Smith applied to the Defense Honors and Awards Appeals Tribunal for a formal review of 13 remaining cases. Among them was a posthumous honor for Warrant Officer John William Kirby. The tribunal held hearings in March 2016. A Defense Department representative appeared and stated that the Army opposed a merit review. They had already conducted a process review, the representative explained, and as far as the Army was concerned, no further examination was necessary. In August 2016, the tribunal delivered its findings. 10 soldiers received new or upgraded awards. Among them, a Commendation for Gallantry, posthumously for 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, recognized 50 years after he stood up in the rain to redirect artillery fire that saved his platoon. The tribunal did not recommend the highest honor for Jack Kirby. It found that the Distinguished Conduct Medal awarded to him in 1966 was the appropriate recognition for his conduct and leadership in the field. Smith received this finding at 82. He had been prosecuting this particular argument for 50 years. He did not stop. In the years when the bureaucratic fight was not consuming him, he sailed 150,000 nautical miles along the East Coast over 3 decades, the kind of solitary, precise navigation that suited a man who had spent his working life doing things that required exactness and could not be redone. He died on the 20th of August, 2023. He was 90 years old. He died 2 days after the 57th anniversary of the battle. Kirby's honor had not changed. There is a concrete cross in the Long Tan rubber plantation. Veterans of the 6th Battalion erected it on the 18th of August, 1969, 3 years after the battle, on the site of 11 Platoon's last stand. It was rough, scarred, flown in by helicopter, and set into the red dirt of the place where Gordon Sharp had died, and Buick had held what remained of his platoon together. The cross would have a complicated life, removed from the site, repurposed, eventually recovered, and housed in a museum. A replica now stands at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Veterans came to regard it as the symbol not just of one afternoon in 1966, but of everyone who served in Vietnam, which tells you something about the way a country eventually comes to terms with a war it was not proud of, and the way soldiers insist on being remembered long after the country would prefer to move on. The 18th of August is now Vietnam Veterans Day in Australia, formalized in 1987, when Prime Minister Hawke announced it following the Welcome Home Parade for Vietnam veterans. The parade had not occurred until 2 decades after the men came home. The date was chosen because of what happened in Phuoc Toi Province on one particular afternoon, and what it commemorates is not a victory in the military sense. It is a stand. 108 against 2,500. 3.5 hours. 18 dead, most of them conscripts who never asked to be there. And a second fight, carried by one man for half a century, against an institution that understood its own convenience better than its debts. What 108 soldiers proved on the 18th of August, 1966, was not that superior firepower wins. It was that human beings under conditions most of us cannot imagine will still do what the job requires if they have been prepared well enough, trusted enough, and led by people who believe in them completely. Smith believed in his men completely. Kirby distributed ammunition in the rain, while a machine gun was being set up 50 meters away, and came back from silencing it. Sharp stood up to direct the fire and did not come back. Stanley called in 61 fire missions from a muddy map and saved people he had barely known before June of that year. Buick asked for fire on his own position because he would rather die doing something than live by doing nothing. When the Army denied these men what they had earned, it was not denying abstractions. It was denying specific, documented acts by specific people who had been there and done them. Harry Smith knew this. He spent 50 years making sure the record said so. Now you do too.